Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Café on Tampa Online. Today, we got a great guest talking about some important topics. I'm going to hand off to Della Costa to introduce our guest.
Good afternoon, everybody in the Café on Tampa community. We are glad that you're here joining us today, and we miss you. Our guest speaker today is Ron Pierce. Ron is the president of RSA Consulting Group, which is located in Hillsborough County. Ron, tell us a little bit about yourself and what does a lobbyist do for clients?
Sure, Del and Bill, first of all, thank you for having me. Again, Ron Pierce, I'm the president and CEO of RSA Consulting Group. We are a lobbying firm based here in Hillsborough County. We have an office in Brandon as well as an office in Tallahassee. And we get that question all the time, by the way. What in the world does a lobbyist do for clients? And really at the end of the day, clients hire lobbyists for two reasons. Number one, their knowledge of the process. And I was blessed to work for a number of elected officials here in Hillsborough and Tallahassee, and so have a really good understanding of the public policy process from within the process. And then number two is having relationships in that process. And so, what we do is we become their voice for clients before local government and state government. So and it's a wide variety of issues, anything from tourism to economic development to transportation to education to healthcare. As a contract lobbying firm, we're involved in a number of related issues. And I'm very blessed to represent about 60 different groups from the Tampa Bay area and across the state as well.
And I want to welcome all of our online viewers, the ones that are looking at this live and then later on. And we try to listen to our community and listen to ideas they have. And this recommendation came from Krista Landers, who's a regular in our in-person meetings and also online. So thank you, Krista, for recommending Ron. We're going to be talking about Tallahassee and also some local issues and elections. And there's way too much to cover in a half hour. So I'll be quiet in a second. But please, we do this as a public service. And we offer this information for free. So please hit the share button so your friends and family and colleagues can see it. And then also Café con Tampa style, while we're watching live, you can ask a question by posting underneath or to the right of the view. Ron, tell us the highlights of what happened in the last legislative session. It seems like years ago, but can you just hit on the highlights of what happened?
No, absolutely. And let me kind of talk about, they passed let me start with, Bill, they passed a $93 billion budget. In the middle of that budget process is really when COVID started happening. So I'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of issues relating to healthcare, a lot of scope of practice related issues were passed in Tallahassee this year. There were some key projects brought back to Tampa Bay with regards to local projects for Hillsborough County, Pinellas, and for the greater Tampa Bay area, and some big transportation projects as well. But let me talk about the budget for a second, because when we passed the budget, when the legislature passed the budget back in March, they were doing that based upon revenue estimates that were obviously done before kind of pre-COVID. And, there's going to be huge budget impact, not only on the current, the past fiscal year that has ended on June 30th, but also the new fiscal year that started on July 1st. Last year, if you already look at from March through June, state budget was probably impacted by almost $2 billion. That's not including any potential impacts for, moving forward. So I think as you kind of look at last year, one thing I would talk about is, the governor did the budget back in June and did about $1 billion in vetoes. The governor kind of had to do that because they had about $2 billion in reserves. That additional billion plus another $1 billion in reserves. The federal dollars they currently have as well. They probably are sitting on about $6 billion in reserves, and they're going to probably need a lot of those dollars to be able to sustain any holes they have to fill from last fiscal year, but more importantly, looking at 2020 and 2021's budget, because obviously tourism is a huge driver of our economy, and tourism is being dramatically impacted across the state at the moment.
I can't think of any new sources of revenue that the state can tap into. Other than one question I want to ask, what is the prospects of a new Seminole gaming compact?
Dale, that's very insightful, because that is probably one thing they could tap into that would be a new source of revenue. There currently is not a Seminole gaming compact with the state. I won't bore all the viewers with why that is, but the punchline is today, the state is not collecting about $350 million a year from the current compact, which is tax collected from gaming on the Seminole sites throughout the state of Florida. There's been talk over the last 2 years of renewing and actually not only renewing the contract, but more importantly, adding some new provisions to it, such as live sports betting. The United States Supreme Court ruled a couple of years ago that you cannot prohibit states from offering online sports betting. You've had a number of states now take that up, creating that as a revenue stream for their states. There's been talk about adding roulette, some talk about adding craps to the equation as well. If you add all of that, it takes probably the current compact of about 350 million that's not being collected. That would probably nearly double that, if not more than that. So, that would be recurring revenue to the state if the legislature wanted to try to renew that compact, which they may need it over the next couple of years from a revenue standpoint.
Educate us. Are there any other potential sources of revenue?
I think that's probably the one that the legislature would consider. I think at this point, with the Republican-controlled legislature in Tallahassee, I couldn't see them probably looking at any additional new taxes or fees, especially on the Florida House side. So I think that's probably the best source of new revenue they would look at over the next couple of years.
What do you think are the main issues that are going to be up in the next legislative session? And tell us, with COVID-19 happening, when committees start or if they're going to start.
I think so. Number one, we go back to a traditional calendar next year. So with it being an election year, committee weeks are supposed to start in January. There'd be 2 in January, 3 in February. Session starts in March. So if we follow that traditional calendar, that's when things will kind of start back up. I can tell you, obviously, budget will be first and foremost, looking at some of the budget issues they're going to face. One issue that they could look at next year, and kind of going back to Dell's question from earlier, is they could look at trying to collect sales tax from online sales. Something the Senate's looked at the last couple of years. The House hasn't had a lot of interest in it, but there's a lot of dollars that are not collected through the sale of merchandise in the state of Florida through online sales. So that's something they could look at. I think Medicaid, something they're going to have to look at next year. If you look at the way our budget's built in the state of Florida, when times are good and when people are working, there's a lot of revenue coming in the state. Like right now, when there's a dip in the economy, social services go up. And as a part of social services, Medicaid, people that may need some of their health care paid through Medicaid, that also rises. We're hearing estimates right now that Medicaid costs for next fiscal year could go up by nearly $1 billion. And so having to come up with a way to, I think, address those. Tourism and economic development, it's been something that's been front and center in Tallahassee the last couple of years. And, is the legislature going to be able to go back and look at potentially incentives and other opportunities for tourism and economic development to try to kind of kickstart the economy again? And the last is schools. I mean, there's a lot of debate right now about are schools going to go back in person? They're going to go back on, online. There's a lot of issues that revolve around that from a funding standpoint and other issues. And so I think education is going to be another key issue they're going to talk about next year in Tallahassee.
What is the prognosis that you see with agriculture, which is a big industry in our state, although a lot of people don't realize it? We know tourism, but what about agriculture and the export of agriculture?
Absolutely, that's a huge issue. So if you look at the way our economy is structured, there's really 3 drivers. Number 1 is construction. Number 2 is agriculture. Number 3 is tourism. Those are kind of the three economic drivers for the state. Tourism, agriculture is critically important from an export standpoint. And, if you look at some of the, Nikki Freed, the commissioner of agriculture and consumer services in Tallahassee, it's something that she's very involved with from a promotion standpoint, not only in Florida, but more importantly, outside our borders as well. So I don't think it's something the legislature will do. I think it's something they will continue to do, though, from an export standpoint, trying to make sure that agriculture stays one of our top 3 pillars of our economy.
Who are some of our key legislative leaders here in Tampa Bay?
So we're very blessed. If you look at the legislative leadership that has been coming out of Tampa Bay, I mean, Bill Galvano, Senator Galvano, the current Senate president down in Manatee County, he's been Senate president the last 2 years. Wilton Simpson from Pasco County, Senator Simpson will be the next Senate president following him. So we'll have him for 2 years in a very key position. Representative Chris Sprowls from over in Pinellas County is the incoming speaker. So we're very blessed to have not only the incoming Senate president, but the incoming speaker as well. So having both of those come from our area. In addition to that, you've got Representative Jamie Grant, who's a leader in the House. He'll be somebody that will be very engaged in policy decisions in the Florida House. You've got Lawrence McClure, Representative Lawrence McClure from over in Plant City. He'll be in leadership for the next 6 years. He's a freshman, but Danny Perez from Miami and he have worked out a deal where Representative Perez will probably be speaker in 4 years. And when he takes over, I can tell you Lawrence McClure from Plant City will be very, very involved in that speakership. And will be nice to have somebody from Tampa Bay kind of being the right hand of the speaker at that point in time.
Ron, you are very involved in county politics and regional politics going way back. And what do you see as kind of the political power structure these days? There was this group that took over the county back in, 98 or 99. And, one of the gentlemen who was leader of it since passed away. And, there have been other leaders that have risen over time. How do you kind of look at the political power landscape behind the elected officials in Hillsborough and the region?
Well, and Bill, that's a great question. And the way I view it is, I think you've got a lot of different groups right now that are trying to get our elected officials to think more regionally. I think you're right. I think in the past, if you look back over the last 20 years, a lot of people kind of look at from a political standpoint or a public policy standpoint, look at Hillsborough, or they look at Pinellas, or you look at Pasco, or you look at Manatee County. And I think you've kind of seen a shift over the last couple of years where you're really trying to get folks from the business community to really start having our elected leaders think from a regional standpoint. And I'll use transportation as a great example of that, right? Nobody cares when they're in their car that I'm crossing from one county to another county. They just want to have really good regional transportation. And there's a number of groups right now that are working on regional projects, such as the bus rapid transit project. That's going to be connecting Pasco County all the way down to St. Petersburg along I-275. You've got workforce related issues, making sure that from an economic development standpoint, that as we approach these economic development projects and workforce projects, it's not just a Hillsborough project, or it's not just a Pinellas project, but really making sure that Tampa Bay as a whole is being competitive and having a voice in those discussions.
Our viewership and our membership at Café con Tampa has always been made up of involved people in the community, especially neighborhood association leaders. Is there any benefit for an individual or a group of neighbors or community to travel to Tallahassee to lobby for specific projects, or do they need to hire somebody like you?
Well, number one, I always like to be hired, Dell. So let me put that out there first. But I will tell you, I think first and foremost, if people are waiting to go to Tallahassee to try to have a voice in the process, they've missed that opportunity. First and foremost is, if anybody has issues that they know they're going to have in Tallahassee, meet with your elected officials in their district office. Meet with them over the summer and fall, and make sure you talk about if it's an appropriations project or economic development project, or if it's a public policy issue. Obviously make sure they understand why it's important to the community. I can tell you these elected officials would much rather talk to you and leaders from our community than talking to lobbyists. They know that we're there and we see them all the time. But if they have a constituent and a voter and a taxpayer show up in their office and share with them, some concerns or support for an issue, it's going to be much more meaningful. And obviously, it depends on the project. Look, if it's a big project that it's going to have a lot of issues in Tallahassee, probably having somebody that can walk you through the process, or maybe potentially even after if you have to hire somebody. But Tallahassee is a very complicated place. 5-6 committee weeks leading into session this upcoming year, session for 9 weeks, making sure that these elected officials who get very, very busy don't lose sight and focus of the issues and the concerns that you've raised to them. But first and foremost, I will tell anybody that's listening, if you want to get engaged with your elected officials, do it in their office. Most people are surprised, by the way, if you call their district office and say, I've got this transportation issue, or I've got this economic development issue, or I'm having this issue from a business licensing standpoint, can I come sit down with you and your staff? Most of these elected officials, not only local, but our state ones, would welcome the opportunity to sit down with their constituents.
I think that's an answer that we're going to be able to repeat over and over again at Cafe con Tampa, Bill.
Hey, yeah, and by the way, anybody who's just watching, this is Ron Pierce from RSA Consulting, and he's talking about Tallahassee. We're going to talk about politics in a minute, but if you have any questions, post underneath or to the right of the feed, and please don't forget to share it, the feed with so your friends and family can see. Ron, a lot of our viewers are really interested in the arts, and this year the legislature actually funded a lot of the local arts groups, and then the governor, when he was doing his edits or vetoes at the end, and it's post-pandemic or during the pandemic, several of them got axed. What do you think is kind of the word about the arts organizations in Tallahassee right now? Setting aside the current budget issues, are the arts a priority? Is it something that legislators and the governor find important or not?
I think they do find it important, and there's been more and more support over the last 3 or 4 years. It's something we've really done a good job, I think, through the arts community of kind of building up that voice and speaking with one voice in Tallahassee. We have the pleasure of representing the Strass Center as well as Tampa Theater, and one of our projects was vetoed for the Strass Center, and we probably knew that was coming. We knew that if you're going to veto $1 billion, different projects would have to be vetoed. We figured a lot of the projects from Tampa Bay, including the Strass Center, would be vetoed. I will tell you, it was only vetoed because of COVID-related budget issues. It wasn't vetoed because there's a lack of support. I will tell you, there's been an effort by the arts community over the last 4 years to really spend more time in Tallahassee and to really speak with one voice about, I think the arts community over the years have done a really good job of speaking individually about, this is my impact. This is the impact of the Strass Center on Tampa, or the impact of the Phillips Center over in Orlando. But having all of them come together and kind of speak with one voice about, as an industry, this is the potential impact that we're having on the state of Florida, has been really, really powerful. So I know a lot of those groups will be back next year. I will tell you, I think next year will be another bad budget year potentially for projects, but you have to continue to ask, obviously, and try to get some of these projects funded, because you can obviously make the argument from an economic development standpoint and from a job standpoint, these opportunities will create additional opportunities for workforce in the state.
There are several, just to follow on that for a second, there are several arts groups that have big capital campaigns going on, tens of millions, $100 million, and there are at least, I think, 4 or 5 in the community going on. What's the likelihood in this environment, this economic environment, that the legislature would find any money for that?
I think it's tough, and I think number one, I think a lot of those groups right now that are going through any type of a campaign is probably going to push pause, number one, due to the economic climate that we're in. And number two is, I will tell you, we're going to share with our clients at least is, I think next year you have to be very selective on what your asks are going to be, because you have to really understand the budget environment that we're going to be facing in Tallahassee next year. There'll probably be a budget deficit they're going to have to backfill. There's potentially they may even have to go to a special session, after the elections to kind of do some budget modifications. So there's always that opportunity. That's where the compact and other revenue opportunities could come in as part of that discussion. But I think next year is going to be very difficult potentially to go to Tallahassee and get some individual projects.
Continuing on the arts and culture at the national level, I've been reading and observing that there's an estimate that approximately a third of the museums and live performance venues will not be able to survive through the year. Do you see that happening in Florida, or do you see the possibility of the state having to introduce, and I know you said no new taxes, but like a war tax for a 2 or 3 year period of time, so that we don't lose valuable resources that could take years to rebuild?
Sure. I think many of those different groups applied for PPP, by the way, and so some of them who probably received PPP will be able to sustain through July, August, September timeframe. Then it gets difficult after that. So if you're a performing arts center and Broadway has already said that you're not going to be touring until 2021, possibly the spring of 2021, it becomes very difficult, obviously, from a revenue standpoint, to be able to sustain yourself. We're hearing talk out of Washington, D.C. that there is some legislation that has been filed up there to try to help not only performing arts, but the arts community in general to be included as a part of any packages that come out. So I think DC is looking at potentially some dollars that could be used for performing arts centers, different museums, and so on. Many of that would probably be tied through doing it through local governments, possibly through the state. But I wouldn't be surprised if you see Washington, D.C. step in and potentially approve some type of a pot of money that could help sustain these groups for the next 6 to 12 months.
So Del, I want to pivot to politics since we're in like the last 10 minutes, if you don't mind. Ron, tell us what you think which way the winds are blowing in Florida, what you think is going to happen. We've got a big election coming up in just a couple of weeks. The people are voting now. So any predictions or insights for that election and also November?
So I will tell you this, Bill, is I would not envy anybody that's on the ballot today, because, just running a campaign, just having to deal with how in the world do you run a campaign in COVID? Because, most campaigns that are very successful, they walk door to door. So many people that are listening, you've got candidates who show up at your door, knock and introduce themselves and hand you some literature and talk a little bit about themselves as a candidate. That's really, really tough to do in this environment. So, candidates are really right now limited to potentially lip dropping, where they just go, they don't talk to the voter, but put something on their door. I don't know about you gentlemen, but most of the time when somebody leaves on my door, I probably don't even look at it. It ends up in the trash. So that's not going to be a great way to reach voters. The best way to reach voters in all of this is going to be mail, it's going to be television, and it's going to be digital ads. And to do all three of those things, you need to be able to raise money. So it probably gives incumbents a pretty big advantage, because as you all know, incumbents' ability to raise money is a little bit easier than somebody that's running for office for the first time. So if you're an incumbent in this political environment, I think you would probably have an advantage. And if you're somebody that's running for a district, it's not cost as much. So if you're running for a district county commission seat, like District 1, Harry Cohen's running for that seat, it's probably less for Harry Cohen to try to raise dollars to be able to do mail or, one-on-one contact with voters than running countywide. So you got Pat Kemp and Sandy Merman, which is probably, the biggest county commission battle in Hillsborough County that we're all going to see in between now and November. It's a countywide seat. You can't walk door to door. You couldn't walk the county to begin with. Yes, Hillsborough County has been turning more and more Democrat, but I think in that seat, whoever raises the most amount of money to be able to do voter contact through mail and through television will probably be successful.
What about on the state rep seats? I know you probably don't want to call winners, but let me
just highlight a couple. I mean, over Representative Hattersley's seat over in Brandon is an open seat. Representative Hattersley going to run for Congress. You've got a couple of Republicans in that seat that are running. Michael Owens and Danny Kushmer are running for that seat. So watch that. It's a very contested Republican primary. I believe Michael Owens will win that seat at the end of the day, but I think it's going to be very close. This could be a very competitive seat. Over in Tampa, Jackie Toledo has an opponent, Representative Toledo, and that could be a very, it's a seat I know the Democrats are trying to target. I think Representative Toledo will be successful at the end of the day, just because of her hard work, by the way. I mean, if you look at her campaign and not only the money she's raised, but they're out doing a really good job, from mail, some doing television, and they are doing phone banking and trying to do some door-to-door activity as well.
What is being said today in Tallahassee about the 2021 session and COVID-19? I know nobody has a crystal ball, but how are they planning for this next year?
Well, and it's funny you asked me that question. So I had a client call me yesterday and say, hey, usually around this time of year, we're planning our Tallahassee trip for the 2021 session. How do we do that? And, my answer is, I guess we go ahead and reserve the space. I think we go ahead and kind of, maybe reserve a block of hotel rooms. But We don't know what travel is going to look like. We don't know if there's going to be restricted access to the Capitol yet. We don't know, do they start committee weeks in January? Do they push committee weeks back? Session has to start in March for the Constitution. Do they go in but then extend session to where you start in March but you actually push it out where you can do some business and really have maybe session end in June potentially. Remember, they have to have a budget done by July 1st, and so having a budget done by July 1st means you have to have everything done probably sometime by early June to give the governor the ability to be able to act upon it prior to it going into law July 1.
I want to ask you about a couple more races, if we could. Folks are looking at the governor's race in a couple of years. There's some Democratic names being circulated around that could potentially run against the governor. Or maybe even other cabinet seats. Any thoughts or ideas on what might happen there?
Well, I think number one, I think Nikki Fried's definitely in. I don't think she would say that at this point, but she's the current commissioner of agriculture. She's the highest ranking Democratic elected official in the state. Wilton Simpson, who'll be the Senate president at that point, has already pretty much said he wants to run for commissioner of agriculture. And so you potentially have Nikki running against the sitting Senate president to keep her seat, or she could turn around and run for governor. So I think you have, I think that's one person for sure. Gwen Graham, I think, will be back. I think Gwen looks, she was very competitive last time in the Democratic primary, lost a very close primary election. I think Gwen will be back, and I think that's somebody, I think those are probably the two biggest names that people are talking about. Obviously, you've got a bunch of mayors across the state that have been very active and have been great leaders during these issues with COVID. You could see some of those folks maybe potentially be mentioned as either a running for governor or potentially lieutenant governor candidate along the way. But I really think that those are the two big names you're going to see kind of begin to position themselves once we get to November.
What about Representative Val Denning?
I'm sorry?
What about Representative Val Denning from Orlando?
I think part of that depends on what happens over the next few months leading in. Does she end up as a VP opportunity, number one, and then number two is if she's not selected, but Biden's elected president, my guess would be she'd probably end up at an appointment somewhere in DC.
So there's also, I have to ask you this, there's also a rumor on Twitter a couple of days ago that David Jolly might run against Marco Rubio and not as a Republican. Do you think anybody could beat Marco or Rick Scott?
I think anything's possible in this political environment. Again, if you look at the state, it's, if you look at Democratic versus Republicans that are, it is a blue state on paper. It obviously performs very much as a red state still, if you look at kind of our elected officials statewide. However, I could see, obviously a Democratic, somebody running from the Democratic Party against Rubio. And I think, I think Jolly would have to determine is, does he run as an independent? Does he run as a Democrat? Running as an independent makes it very, very difficult. And running as an independent, to be honest, probably only hurts really the Democratic candidate.
Del, do you have any final questions? We're in the last couple of minutes.
Well, we've been asking a lot of predictions. Where do you see Tom Lee going now?
That's a great question. I know a lot of people were disappointed that he kind of stepped away from the Florida Senate. I think a lot of people were, encouraged him to run here locally for clerk of the court. And he decided to really spend more time with his family. As you all know, Laura Lee, his wife, is a current Secretary of State and spending a lot of time in Tallahassee due to that. So I think at this point he's applied to, he'll be interviewed by the Public Service Commission to be one of their commissioners in a couple of weeks. Hopefully that pans out. He'll end up on the list that goes to the governor. A lot of people have asked me, do I think he would potentially run for office again in the future? I've known Tom for a long time, consider him a mentor. I will tell you, I would rule nothing out with that gentleman. I think he's a class act, and I think he can do whatever he wants to do in the future as it comes with regard to politics.
Well, thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks for participating. We wish we could meet in person again. but it looks like it might be at least a couple months before we're able to do that. So in the meantime, thanks for engaging us here online, and thanks to Ron. Ron, any final thoughts or words or websites you want to send us to? Any final thoughts?
Sure. No, first of all, again, thank you all for the time. If you all want to learn more about, us, I'm at RSA Consulting Group, rsaconsulting.com. So again, it's rsaconsultingllc.com. Visit us there. The one thing I would encourage you all to do, Republican, Democrat, Independent, most people already have, vote by mail ballots are already out. Early voting starts next week. Make sure you all vote. Get out and vote, especially during the primary season. There's a lot of key races on the ballot, including some judgeships. Make sure you do your homework there to make sure you kind of know what you're voting for. But make sure you get involved. I mean, get involved. This is your democracy. Make sure that you're voting. You have no right to complain about our elected officials if you're not showing up and casting your ballot. So make sure you all cast your ballot, not only in the primary, but the general election as well. It's going to be a big, big election season, and we need to make sure that we have the right people representing us, not only in Tallahassee, not only here locally, but more importantly in Washington, D.C. as well.
Well, thank you so much for participating today. Look forward to having you come give another update sometime soon. And thanks everybody for watching. Don't forget to hit the share button. See you next time.